Hi, my name is Arielle Levy. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine and the author of a memoir called The Rules Do Not Apply. And I'm going to talk to you for the next 4 weeks about writing memoir and first-person essays. This week, we are going to talk about developing the narrator in first-person writing. They call writing about yourself first person for a reason. When you're writing about yourself, you're writing about the person whose interests and flaws you are most intimately acquainted with, the person whose agenda you've spent your life trying to fulfill. The good news is that you have access to a ton of information about this protagonist. The bad news is that we all have blind spots that we need to overcome if we are going to be reliable narrators. And we must be. That's something writing memoir or personal essays has in common with writing in general. The reader needs to trust the writer. The reader needs to feel she is in good hands with the person leading her through the narrative. In order to provide that when I'm writing, I often find myself thinking specifically about the reader's needs, as in, what does the reader need to hear to understand the character I'm trying to represent? It's not that I'm trying to please the reader. Frankly, it's more like I'm trying to manipulate the reader as well as I can. I think, what does he need to hear at this point in the story to feel the feelings I want him to feel, or to understand the idea I'm trying to convey? So it's actually the opposite of scrambling to be likable to the reader. I'm just selfishly trying to ensure I have the effect on the reader that I intend to. Right now, when I'm talking about a reliable narrator, I don't mean a well-behaved narrator. In Bill Clegg's fascinating memoir, Portrait of an Addict as a Young Man, we know from the very title that we are about to hear a story about someone who will almost certainly lie and put himself and maybe other people in dangerous situations. And indeed, on the very first page, Clegg writes, Mark is squawking about a crack dealer he used to buy from who's been busted, how he saw it coming, how he always does. But I'm not paying attention. All that matters to me is that we've reached the end of our bag. The thumb-sized, clear plastic mini Ziploc that once bulged with chunks of crack is now empty. It's daybreak and the dealers have turned off their phones. So we know he's up to no good, right? He's not reliable in the sense of being someone you'd want to lend your car to, but he's reliable as a narrator because he's clearly honest about his own motivations. He tells us very frankly, I'm not paying attention. All that matters to me is that we've reached the end of our bag. That's damning and humiliating, but he levels with us. So already we can trust this narrator to tell us the truth about himself and his own internal life. And we can trust from the precision of the writing and the suspense he's already built in the first few paragraphs that this is going to be a good story, well told. Moreover, we can tell this narrator is going to bring us into a world and really guide us. He's not going to assume we know that crack dealers all turn off their phones during the day. I didn't know that. And that is so important. One of the joys of reading is that we get to learn about another world, its customs, its aesthetic, its smells and tastes and sounds, the quirks that make it specific. This applies to the world of crack dealers, or the world of dry cleaners, or the world of Navy SEALs. Remember, your reader doesn't know that stuff about you and your world unless you tell her. We're not all crack addicts, but we all inhabit our own particular universe, and since we're inside it, it can be easy to forget that the reader has no way of knowing what your apartment looks like, or your mother sounds like, or your kitchen smells like. So in those Bill Clegg sentences, we find out that he's really going to take us by the hand. We can trust him to guide us on this journey because this narrator is clear and frank, and we can also trust that there will be propulsive motion to pull us through this story. He's already got me wondering from the first few paragraphs, what is going to happen? Will he get more crack? Will he overdose? What's the upshot of this unhinged behavior going to be? A feeling of propulsive motion in a story is counterintuitively relaxing. You don't have to worry when you're reading a story with suspense and propulsive motion that you're going to get bored or that you're going to be lost in some murk where the writer is just ruminating and going nowhere. If you can feel motion while you're reading, you can relax. You trust that the writer is getting you somewhere and isn't just stuck in place or lost. And maybe you even forget for a while that there is a narrator or a writer. You're just reading, you're just absorbed. So that's something worth striving for. Even if you are describing a situation in which your narrator is out of control and desperate for crack at daybreak, you still want your reader to feel that the writer behind the narrator is in control and knows where she's going with the story. So that's one of our many jobs as writers. We have to be the reader's guide through the story. We have to take the reader with us on the journey of our story and be aware that they don't know anything that we don't tell them, which can be particularly easy to forget when you're writing about yourself. So who is your narrator? Let's go back a step and start with your narrator's creator, you. Who are you? What are the essential details of your appearance and your experience? What would a stranger need to know to get an accurate sense of you? What are the constituent parts of your history that are crucial? To know me, I feel like it's really important to know that I'm forceful, I'm a writer, I'm loud, I have curly hair, I'm an only child, I'm an extrovert, and I'm silly. I'm not nearly as serious as most of my colleagues at The New Yorker. So those are some things about me that are all true. But when I was writing, for instance, a personal essay called Thanksgiving in Mongolia, some of those things were salient and some weren't. It was more important in that piece for the reader to understand the narrator's craving for adventure than it was for the reader to know that I'm an extrovert. It was important for the reader to know that I was a writer, but it didn't matter that I'm also a gardener. You could read that piece and know a lot about me, but you wouldn't know everything, obviously. And as the writer, I chose which things I wanted to share, not based on the things I feel reflect best upon me, but based on the things about me that served that story. Things that were crucial for the reader to know in order to experience that story the way I wanted him or her to. So give that some thought. In order to tell the particular story you want to tell, what aspects of your character and history and agenda are relevant? The objective is not to sound exactly the same on the page as you do in real life. You can be smarter on the page, for one thing, because you get to think through what you're presenting and how you're presenting it in a way you obviously don't get to when you're just talking. You can be funnier, or for that matter, more serious on the page if it suits your particular subject matter. What I'm saying is that when you're writing about yourself, you're still creating a character, a narrative voice, and you have choices. You can be intense in writing in a way that would be embarrassing in real life. Or you can be more distant and formal. The narrator who comes forth in your story should obviously be an authentic iteration of who you are. You're not trying to fool anyone or invent a protagonist out of thin air. Or if you are, then just be aware you're writing fiction, not memoir. But even in a nonfiction, totally authentic and accurate piece of first-person writing, you are shaping a character as well as a story. Listen to this passage from Nora Ephron's first-person essay on maintenance. Sometimes I think that not having to worry about your hair anymore is the secret upside of death. Tell the truth. Aren't you sick of your hair? Aren't you tired of washing and drying it? I know people who wash their hair every day, and I don't get it. Your hair doesn't need to be washed every day any more than your black pants have to be dry cleaned every time you wear them. But no one listens to me. It takes some of my friends an hour a day, 7 days a week, just to wash and blow dry their hair. How they manage to have any sort of life at all is a mystery. I mean, we're talking about 365 hours a year, 9 work weeks. Maybe this made sense when we were young, when the amount of time we spent making ourselves look good bore some correlation to the number of hours we spent having sex, which was, after all, one of the reasons for our spending so much time on grooming. But now that we're older, whom are we kidding? So, the narrator who emerges in the passage I just read is obviously funny, but she's also older and joyfully outraged. Those are all things that we learn. We get the feeling that we're hearing from a plucky, tart, really fun woman of a certain age. The narrator we meet in this piece is the right version of Ephron to talk about the indignities of keeping up appearances in your 60s. It's authentically Ephron, but it's also an appropriate narrator for the subject matter, which is light, and the stakes are low-ish. That essay was collected with others in Ephron's book, I Feel Bad About My Neck. Now listen to a passage from a different first-person piece in that book called Consider the Alternative. The honest truth is that it's sad to be over 60. The long shadows are everywhere. Friends dying and battling illness. A miasma of melancholy hangs there, forcing you to deal with the fact that your life, however happy and successful, has been full of disappointments and mistakes, little ones and big ones. There are dreams that are never quite going to come true, ambitions that will never quite be realized. In short, there are regrets. So it's the same writer in the passage we just heard, and she's still a wealthy white lady talking about being in her 60s and getting older. But she's an entirely different kind of narrator in this piece. She's somber and grappling with regret and longings, and there's a sadness hanging over her, which we learn later in the piece is there for a specific reason. I'm going to read you one more piece from that essay. She writes, "My friend Judy died last year. She was the person I told everything to. She was my best friend, my extra sister, my true mother, sometimes even my daughter. She was all these things, and one day she called up to say, the weirdest thing has happened. There's a lump on my tongue. Less than a year later, she was dead. She was 66 years old. She had no interest in dying right to the end. She died horribly, and now she's gone. I think of her every day, sometimes 6 or 7 times a day. I have her white cashmere shawl. I wore it for days after her death. I wrapped myself up in it and even slept in it. But now I can't bear to wear it because it feels as if that's all there's left of my Judy." So this narrator, Ephron Crafts, has a very different vibe from the one who was guiding us through the previous personal essay about aging. Even though it's the same writer who is in some ways writing about the same topic, which is aging, the narrator of the first piece is bubbly and tart, whereas the narrator in the second piece is heartbroken and reflective. So which authentic version of yourself is the one who would make the best guide for your reader as he or she hears the particular story you plan to tell? Think for a moment about your relationship with the reader in terms of a scene in a movie. If your narrator and your reader were together on screen, what kind of scene would it be? Would they have an intimate relationship in which they tell each other their most personal secrets and feelings? Or would it be more like a lively discussion at a dinner party between new acquaintances where there's some distance, which can also make for delightful reading? I'm thinking now about the tone the writer Michael Korda brought to his memoir, Country Matters. From the very beginning, Margaret had been skeptical of the Ferrari. The day it arrived, I had reserved a table for a celebratory dinner at the Old Drovers Inn in Dover Plains, about 45 minutes away, and looked forward to driving over there in the Ferrari. Being squeezed into the narrow confines of the cockpit with a bellowing 8-cylinder engine sending out waves of heat and noise right behind her ears was not Margaret's idea of the best way to turn up for dinner, elegantly coiffed and dressed. But it was unfortunate that the air conditioning failed as soon as we were on the highway, as well as the electric motors that lowered the windows, thus leaving us in an increasingly hot, confined space until the atmosphere was that of a steam bath, if you can imagine a steam bath with loud engine noises and the odor of damp leather upholstery. The relationship between this narrator and his reader, us, is friendly, but it's not intimate. I don't expect this narrator to tell me about his sex life, or if he does, I imagine he'll do so by using wry, polite metaphors. I like this narrator. I want to hear what he has to tell me, but I understand that our relationship is a warm acquaintanceship. That's the kind of relationship this narrator is offering me. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the intimacy we get from Joan Didion in The Year of Magical Thinking, her celebrated memoir of grieving. Reading that book isn't like having a pleasurable conversation at a dinner party. It's an opportunity to know someone, this character, on a very personal level. To hear, in the most elegant sentences, because it's Didion, about her primal emotions in the face of loss and the way her brain sorts through the experience. There is a coldness to the way she writes this story. Her approach is an almost clinical examination of her bereavement. But the relationship between the narrator and the reader is implicitly intimate all the same, because she's telling us about the death of her husband and the illness of her only child. She's treating us as if we are almost like family ourselves by telling us this story. Now, an intimate relationship between narrator and reader can also serve a lighter tone. Roger Angell started his National Magazine award-winning personal essay, This Old Man, like this. Check me out. The top two knuckles of my left hand look as if I'd been worked over by the KGB. No, it's more as if I'd been a catcher for the Hall of Fame pitcher Candy Cummings, the inventor of the curveball, who retired from the game in 1877. To put this another way, if I pointed that hand at you like a pistol and fired at your nose, the bullet would nail you in the left knee. Arthritis. It's a loose but personal relationship he's establishing with the reader. You don't say, check me out, to a business associate. It implies a level of familiarity between the narrator and the reader. And something that immediately draws me in here is his humor. This narrator is going to be funny as he reveals the way age has attacked him. So the reader gets the feeling that we are in with this amusing, open old guy who's going to tell us about himself, and we almost get the sense that he likes us. Here's the next sentence after the one I just read to you. Now, still facing you, if I cover my left or better eye with one hand, what I see is a blurry, encircling version of the ceiling and floor and walls or windows to our right and left, but no sign of your face or head. Nothing in the middle. But cheer up! If I reverse things and cover my right eye, there you are, back again. If I take my hand away and look at you with both eyes, the empty hole disappears and you're in 3D and actually looking pretty terrific today. Macular degeneration. Roger Angell is actually addressing his relationship with the reader, admitting that it exists and that there is a person on the other end of the page, as it were, one who is looking pretty terrific today. In the same way that Charlotte Bronte famously has her protagonist in Jane Eyre tell us, "Reader, I married him." Now, in your work, you can explicitly acknowledge the narrator's relationship with the reader or not. It's not necessary, of course, but it is necessary to take the reader's needs into consideration. That, in my opinion, is the difference between journaling, writing for yourself, about yourself, and professional writing that strives to be art. You're not just writing whatever you feel like, you're writing to be read by others. If people are going to do me the service of taking the time to read what I've written, I always feel I owe them the service of considering their experience. I'm going to recommend you read Roger Angel's This Old Man because it's such a beautiful, funny, heartbreaking, elegant piece of first-person writing, and we'll have a link to it below the video. We're going to be talking about it throughout this class. I keep saying narrator to stress that this is a character you're putting on the page. It's not you, even though when you're writing in the first person, it is about you. I don't actually know Joan Didion after I finish reading The Year of Magical Thinking. I know about the feelings, images, and stories she chose to craft into that book. It can be useful and I think liberating to remember that your narrator, your memoir, is not you. It's a creation of yours. I'm not suggesting you should be inauthentic. If you're inauthentic, you've already lost the game. I'm suggesting you should be deliberate. So who do you want your narrator to be on the page in your memoir or personal essay? Or more importantly, who does your story need you to be? Which version of yourself? For one thing, you want to enter the consciousness of the self from the time in your life you are writing about. If you're writing a scene about your childhood, are you writing it as a child, with a child's vision of the world and a child's understanding of emotion and behavior and consequences? Or are you writing as your current self, with your current perspective, looking back at that time? And regardless of time, to what extent are you inhabiting the narrator's perspective solely? And to what extent do you want to inhabit other characters in the story? Will you be speaking for them or just about them? Are you going to tell us what other people said or tell us what they're thinking and feeling? So for instance, in the poet Nick Flynn's colorfully titled memoir, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, which is largely about his relationship with his father, who is homeless, he sometimes inhabits his father's perspective. In Boston, the bars close at 1. The next wave of revelers, more gregarious than the earlier crowd, bleary and headed home, push their way inside. Sometimes they give you a hassle, sometimes they flip you a few bucks. A little lit, sometimes they try to start up a conversation, sit on the floor next to you, offer you a drink, want to know your name. You seem like a regular guy. How'd you end up here? Where? My father asks. So this is Flynn's memoir. It's his story, and it's in the first person. But in passages like the one I just read, he's speaking for and really as his father. He's telling us what his father witnesses and how people react to him, even though the narrator is still Nick Flynn. He would never use the pronoun I to mean anyone but himself, but we're still getting an experience here that is distinctly his dad's. We're going to do an exercise on perspective to examine this, and you should get out a notebook and a pen to do it or use your computer, however you like to write. And the video will pause, and you want to give yourself about 5 minutes to do this before you hit continue. Think of a first in your life. A first kiss, first heartbreak, first job interview, first experience of violence, first time you drove a car or went swimming or whatever. Something that jumps into your head and is vivid for you, that has some emotional resonance. Now spend about 5 minutes writing that up as your present self, remembering the experience using the past tense. So, I was excited to go to sleepaway camp, not I am excited to go to sleepaway camp. Use the language and consciousness of yourself today to write this, describing your past self, what happened, what you saw and felt and experienced. Go ahead and give yourself about 5 minutes. Welcome back. Now you're going to write the same experience, but as yourself at the time, with no distance whatsoever. So if I was writing about my first day at camp a minute ago, I would have written it as me now remembering. But now I'm going to write it up, the same experience, as if it was being told by me then, at the age of 9, with a 9-year-old's perspective and language, and I'm going to write it in the present tense. This time it is, I am excited to go to sleepaway camp. And then I'm going to tell you about why and what it's like as if I'm 9. Go ahead and you can hit continue in about 5 minutes. Hi again. Okay, we're going to write that up one last time, I promise. But this time we're going to use the third person. Instead of writing as yourself, you're going to write as an omniscient narrator about yourself. So not I was excited about going to sleepaway camp. She was excited. She was excited to go to sleepaway camp. In this iteration, I will write from a God's eye perspective. I know all about what this character, Ariel Levy, felt when she was going off to sleepaway camp in New Hampshire, but I'm also going to allow myself to write as if I know all kinds of things. Not just what Ariel Levy felt, but maybe what her mother felt, putting her only daughter on that overcrowded, under-supervised bus. And maybe I'll write about what the bus driver was experiencing, or what the other kids on the bus were experiencing. Or if I want to go crazy, maybe I'll even personify the bus itself and describe its experience of being crammed full of nervous, excited kids who are leaving home for the first time. The important thing is to write it up as if you aren't looking out of your own eyes, or not only out of your own eyes in this version. You can see everything. You know everything. And you get to decide what to tell the reader. Let's do this in the past tense, not the present. The screaming children pushed to get on the bus to head off to summer camp in New Hampshire, not the screaming children push to get on. Pushed, past tense. This should have some distance, so that's why we're going to try the past tense, looking back from high above where you know everything. Go ahead. Okay, so we've written the same thing 3 different ways. Which way felt the easiest and most comfortable and natural? Which piece of writing do you like the best if you read them all through? Are they the same one? Is the version that was easiest to write the best piece of writing, in your opinion? The point of the exercise is obviously just to experiment with all the different options we have open to us when we tell our own stories. Now, we're working on first-person writing in this class using the I voice, but it can be useful if you get stuck to try writing whatever you're writing, or even try just thinking about whatever you're writing in the third person, as we did in the third exercise, just to get a feel for what it would be like to describe perspectives besides your own, which is something you can do, as Nick Flynn did, even when you're working in the first person and writing nonfiction. You can still occupy the theoretical space of another character's brain and express it. The same flexibility applies to time. You can write in the past tense about something that happened and still inhabit some of the perspective of your younger self. Listen to the opening of Eudora Welty's classic memoir, One Writer's Beginnings. When I was young enough to still spend a long time buttoning my shoes in the morning, I'd listen toward the hall. Daddy upstairs was shaving in the bathroom, and Mother downstairs was frying the bacon. They would begin whistling back and forth to each other up and down the stairwell. My father would whistle his phrase, my mother would try to whistle, then hum hers back. It was their duet. I drew my button hook in and out and listened to it. I knew it was The Merry Widow. The difference was their song almost floated with laughter. How different from the record, which growled from the beginning, as if the Victrola were slowly being wound up. They kept it running between them, up and down the stairs, where I was now just about ready to run, clattering down, and show them my shoes. So this vivid paragraph we are hearing is the adult Welty telling us about the past. We know this based on the use of the past tense, but also based on the language. A kid who is young enough to show off buttoning her shoes doesn't use phrases like Their song almost floated with laughter. And yet there's this wonderfully nostalgic way we feel her inhabiting her child self for moments, partly because it's so vivid and sensuous. It's in the past tense, but yet we're there with her, smelling the bacon and hearing the comforting, joyful sound of this duet. And we can almost feel her child self's excitement at the prospect of showing her parents this accomplishment of doing up her own shoes. So Welty is making use of a great deal in order to create this rich and evocative paragraph. She's using the language and sophistication of her adult self. She's using the sensory experience of her child self. And to a certain extent, she's allowing herself to share with the reader not just her own experience, but what she imagines was her parents' experience. We can feel her mother try and fail to whistle and then just start humming because it's easier for her and it's more fun. Welcome to week 2 of our class on first-person writing. And this week we're going to talk about the journey. How does a writer survey her material and determine the way a narrative will unfold when the material is her own life? How does she know when and where to start and finish her story? This week, we'll explore the relationship between theme and chronology in structure. When do we organize based on ideas, and when do we organize based on time sequence? We will examine what options are available to us in a given story for unspooling a plot on the page. So first of all, let's think about where to begin. When the curtain lifts and the first flash of your story and your narrator are unveiled for the reader, you obviously want him or her to be drawn in immediately. But you also want to set up what's to come: the tone, the concept, and the point. We talked earlier about Bill Clegg's memoir, A Portrait of an Addict as a Young Man. If you recall, the first scene of his book takes place in a crackhead's apartment at daybreak, when the dealers have all shut off their phones and gone to bed, and Clegg and his crack buddy are out of drugs, and Clegg is starting to freak out. He can't concentrate on what the other guy is saying. He's distracted by this empty plastic bag that was full of crack when the night started out. And Clegg pulls us in with him to the frantic desperation that's overcoming him. I've never been addicted to a substance, but I feel like I know exactly what it's like to run out of the thing I need to live when I read this. Clegg writes, "Morning glows behind the drawn blinds. Minutes pass and nothing but the low whine of the garbage trucks outside cuts the quiet. My neck throbs and the muscles in my shoulder feel thick and tight. The throbbing keeps time with my heart, which slams in my chest like an angry fist. I can't stop my body from rocking. I watch Mark get up to begin sweeping the glass and notice how his body rocks with mine, how our sway is synchronized like two underwater weeds bending to the same current. And am both horrified and comforted to recognize how alike we are in the desolate crash that follows when the drugs run out." So Clegg has accomplished several things in that paragraph. He brings us in to the physical sensations of withdrawal and the ominous psychological state of crashing. We are there with him in this very immediate way. And he lets us know that he's become just like the crackhead, Mark, who he sees is pathetic and wrecked, and who he also sees is no different than he is at this moment. The fact that he recognizes this is important. It makes him, once again, reliable for us. If we could see that he was as abject as Mark, but he couldn't, that would be a real problem. Unless that was a temporary state and he was going to come to the realization as we watched that happen, as we saw the progression. But there's still this floating suggestion that maybe he's a little different from Mark, After all, something has changed to enable him to write the book we're reading. The guy shivering at Mark's house couldn't possibly write a book, let alone a good one, so there's obviously a story coming our way. And in the very next paragraph, we get a sense of what's preceded this incident, though we'll have to read the rest of the book to find out what happens subsequently. Clegg writes, "The creeping horror of these past few weeks, relapsing, leaving Noah, my boyfriend, at the Sundance Film Festival nearly a week early, emailing my business partner, Kate, and letting her know that she can do what she wants with our business, that I'm not coming back, checking in and out of rehab in New Canaan, Connecticut, spending a string of nights at the 60 Thompson Hotel, and then diving into the gritty crackscape of Mark's apartment with the drifters there who latch on to the free drugs that come with someone on a bender. The awful footage of my near history flashes behind my eyes, just as the clear future of not having a bag and knowing another won't be had for hours rises up, sharp as the new day." Okay, so now we're starting to get a sense of the bigger picture here. Clegg was obviously successful in various ways. He had a business, he had a relationship, he had enough money to check into a hotel for the first part of his bender. There's been a vertiginous descent into the crackscape of Mark's apartment, as he calls it. And Clegg has gone from being someone who can run a business and go to Sundance and have a boyfriend to someone who is really among his peers in this crack den full of drifters. The great thing about this as an opening scene is that it's vivid, it's an incident he can viscerally bring the reader into, but it also lends itself to this flashback which allows him to bring us up to speed. We are with him, both in the moment in this vivid, sensorial way, and now we are starting to be with him in terms of comprehending the situation more generally. So a lot has to get accomplished right up front. It needs to be a scene or idea the reader can really feel immersed in instantaneously, but it also needs to be grounding and informative for the reader. We want him or her to be brought into the circumstance with some grasp of what's happened or what's about to happen as quickly as possible. Because above all else, we want the reader to feel included in our experience, or why would we be bothering to write about it in the first place? There's something dramatic about starting at the bottom, the way Clegg did. It draws you in like, sheesh, this guy is really in trouble. It's an extremely convenient starting point because it allows a writer to build suspense from two directions at once. How did he get here? How's he going to get out of here? I'm partial to this approach myself. I used it in my own memoir. On the very first page, I wrote, "In the last few months, I have lost my son, my spouse, and my house. Every morning I wake up and for a few seconds I'm disoriented, confused as to why I feel grief seeping into my body. And then I remember what has become of my life." So I put that right at the beginning because I want to draw the reader in and make her wonder, how did all that happen? And I tried to bring the reader into the visceral, physical experience of grief seeping into my body because I want to include the reader. I don't want to seem too incomprehensible or foreign to the reader, which is also why I wrote, entirely honestly, by the way, that every morning I woke up and felt disoriented. Because I want to share my experience with the reader. I want to tell the reader that if he or she feels overwhelmed by what I've just said, so do I. I want the reader to empathize with me, but I also am trying to empathize with him or her in terms of what it's like to read my story. So again, we're connected, narrator and reader. Or anyway, that's my intention. I don't proceed from there chronologically in my book. After that first chapter, which occurs in a state of crisis, I zoom out to the bigger picture of my life and hint at the overarching ideas of the book because I want the reader to have a sense of what led up to this crisis. I started by offering a preview of what was to come, all the bad things that happened, because I thought that was important context. You read that first and it colors the way you read what comes next. From there, I went back in time to a more placid, less fraught period because I wanted the reader to get to know me, to get to know this narrator and care about her so that when her losses happen, they matter to the reader. Now, I may have succeeded or I may have failed, but that was my strategy when I crafted the structure of my memoir. First, a preface that said, I've lost almost everything in my life that's important to me in a very short period of time, and this is my daily physical and emotional experience. I also grounded that first bit in a scene, the way that Bill Clegg offered us that first scene at his crack dealer's house with the light rising in the sky along with Clegg's desperation. The great thing about a scene is that it can be like a little story all in itself with a feeling of a beginning, middle, and end. In Clegg's scene, he starts with them scraping the residue off their crack pipe in desperation. Then Mark, the crackhead, drops the pipe and breaks it, and then he tries to scrape the residue off the glass shards. And all the while, Clegg, our narrator, is getting more desperate, and we are getting to know him better through his description of what he's feeling and his asides, like the paragraph in which he tells us what's happened in his life in the last few weeks during this bender. The scene ends when the phone rings. The dealers have awoken, and ostensibly, Clegg will get his hands on some more crack. It's its own little story with its own resolution. So, in my memoir, in the first scene, I'm lying on the pavement of a parking lot in the pouring rain, looking up at the underside of my Jeep, trying to find the key that my former spouse was supposed to have left for me taped there. But she didn't, so I feel desperate, and it feels like one more thing I've lost. It's right there, but I can't get in. Sort of so close, but no banana, which I'm telling the reader is the story of my life at that moment. I was so close to having this family and a normal life, and then all at once, I lost it all. So if I've done my job right, the reader is then curious about how that all happened. And if the narrator is sufficiently compelling, the reader will then start to care about how she gets herself out of this state of abject grief. We just talked about starting in crisis. That's just one option, of course. What's always a good idea, I think, is to start somewhere visceral and somewhere that indicates the world in which this story is situated and the journey that's coming. Listen to how Alexandra Fuller starts her beautiful memoir, Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, about her childhood in Rhodesia. Mom says, "Don't come creeping into our room at night." They sleep with loaded guns beside them on the bedside rugs. She says, "Don't startle us when we're sleeping." "Why not?" "We might shoot you." "Oh, by mistake." "Okay." "As it is, there seems a good enough chance of getting shot on purpose." "Okay, I won't." So if I wake up in the night and I need Mom and Dad, I call Vanessa because she isn't armed. Van, hey," I hiss across the room until she wakes up. And then Van has to light a candle and escort me to the loo, where I pee sleepily into the flickering yellow light. And Van keeps the candle high, looking for snakes and scorpions and baboon spiders. We learn a lot from this. We know we're in some kind of scenario where people need to sleep with loaded guns by their beds to protect themselves from we're not sure whom. But we know there seems to be a good enough chance of getting shot on purpose by whomever these attackers are. So there's suspense. Why are our narrator and her family under siege? We also know our narrator is a child who is young enough to be afraid to go to the bathroom at night by herself, though I might actually be afraid to go to the bathroom at night if there were snakes and scorpions and baboon spiders crawling around by my toilet. But the language also suggests a certain coziness. She pees sleepily into the flickering yellow light. And she seems to have a kind of no big whoop acceptance of all these guns and the possibility of getting shot. When her mom tells her not to creep in there because she might accidentally blow her away, the narrator doesn't start crying. She comes up with a practical alternative. And all of this is very much what the book is about. The Rhodesian Bush War, Fuller's love of her home despite its dangers and ruggedness, and the fact that, as we will soon find out, Fuller's parents are colonialists who look down on the people who are native to what they called Rhodesia and what is now called Zimbabwe. And these people take up arms against them. So the question of whether this place that feels like home to Fuller really is her home, whether it's a place she and her family have any right to belong in, is central to the book. And that all gets flicked at here in the first few paragraphs. It's also a book about family and the ways we can and can't count on the people we love, the danger we may put them in, unwittingly or not, and the meaning of kinship. And all that is in there too. So you want to begin your story, whether it's a personal essay or a memoir, somewhere that you can both get into easily and from where you can get to a lot of other places easily, like a little inlet where you can push in your canoe and from where you can paddle out to the whole big lake. A place you can get into easily is often a succinct image or scene. Trevor Noah begins his wonderful memoir, Born a Crime, with the image of getting thrown out of a car by his mother. As the first chapter unfurls, we'll come to understand that his mother did this to save his life and jumped out of the car after him with his baby brother in her arms. But when he first gets into it, he does so with suspense. And he does it in a way that makes it comprehensible to almost any reader. He writes, sometimes in a big Hollywood movie, they'll have these crazy chase scenes where somebody jumps or gets thrown from a moving car. The person hits the ground and rolls for a bit. Then they come to a stop and pop up and dust themselves off like it was no big deal. Whenever I see that, I think that's rubbish. Getting thrown out of a moving car hurts way worse than that. I was 9 years old when my mother threw me out of a moving car. Now, from there, he can explain a lot. They were hitchhiking to get home from church, so he tells us all about the 3 different churches his religious mom attended, and significantly, how one church was attended by Black people, and one was attended by white people, and one was attended by people of mixed race. And that's really important in this book about a child of mixed race with a Black mom and a white dad. So we're starting to get a feel for the concerns of the book right up front. He tells us about his relationship with his mother and how naughty he was and how she was always chasing him. And he tells us about the dangerous context in which they're out hitching a ride to church. Apartheid has just ended, and in its wake, there is a terrible period of violence between competing South African political groups like the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. And he explains the way the 2 main groups, the Xhosa and the Zulu, have internalized much of the poison that was spread during apartheid, so that when the driver of this car hears his mother speaking Xhosa, and he sees she's with 2 sons and no husband, and that one of the sons is of mixed race, the driver says he's going to teach her a lesson. So it's a very scary beginning. And his mother does the only thing she can do. When the driver slows down at a red light, she pushes Trevor out of the car and jumps out after him, holding his baby brother. And then they run like hell, bleeding and scraped up as they are, until they get to safety, and then they start arguing. Here's how that scene ends. Finally, I said, "Look, Mom, I know you love Jesus, but maybe next week you could ask him to meet us at our house because this really wasn't such a fun night." She broke out in a huge smile and started laughing. I started laughing too, and we stood there, this little boy and his mom, our arms and legs covered in blood and dirt, laughing together through the pain in the light of the petrol station on the side of the road in the middle of the night. This scene is such a fabulous way for him to start the book because it gives us context. We get to learn about the violence and volatility of the time in which Noah grew up. And it gives us a sense of his relationship with his mother and the way they fought and the way they laughed to get through the hardest times. And he gets into it from a place that's not alienating. Many of his readers will not have been thrown from cars by their mothers or have grown up just as apartheid is ending and warring political factions are murdering people by burning them alive in the streets. But most readers in the United States and South Africa and many other places will have seen at least one Hollywood movie with a car chase that ends with a dude getting thrown to the side of the road, rolling around a little, standing up, dusting himself off unscathed. So Trevor Noah immediately brings us with him into the scene by starting with that. And as I was saying, it's like he puts us in a canoe in some little inlet that's easy to push off from. And then together we go out into the big sea of context. Apartheid, his mom, his experience as a person of mixed race in a country where at the time of his birth it was illegal for him to exist. You want your story to pick up momentum as you go, to build upon itself so that episodes and scenes and themes resonate with what you've already established. Some of this you can plan, and some of it you may discover through the process of writing. Here's a beautiful passage from Eudora Welty's memoir about that experience. Writing a story or a novel is one way of discovering sequence in experience, of stumbling upon cause and effect in the happenings of a writer's own life. This has been the case with me. Connections slowly emerge, like distant landmarks you are approaching. Cause and effect begin to align themselves, draw closer together. Experiences too indefinite of outline in themselves to be recognized for themselves connect and are identified as a larger shape. And suddenly, a light is thrown back, as when your train makes a curve, showing that there has been a mountain of meaning rising behind you on the way you've come, is rising there still, proven now through retrospect. I think this is such a wonderful, lyrical description of the pleasure of writing about your life and the way you discover things along the way. Sometimes you know you want to write about something, maybe an image or an exchange of words you've had or heard, or a little vignette, a flash of a scene. But you don't quite know why you want to write about it or what it means or how it fits into your larger story. That's how I interpret Welty's statement, experiences too indefinite of outline in themselves to be recognized for themselves connect and are identified as a larger shape. As you write, it occurs to you that there are a series of images or scenes or exchanges that all combine to make a meaning. And that is such a satisfying feeling when, as she puts it, suddenly a light is thrown back. Some of that you can figure out while you're writing, and some of it you may be able to figure out while you're planning or outlining. Something I do sometimes when I'm stuck is take a stack of index cards and write some nugget that I think I want to use on each card. So one card might have a fabulous quote I overheard that I think is pertinent. Another card might say, scene where I'm looking under the car for the key. A third might have a conflict I want to make sure to address. That card might say the conflicting human desires for adventure and novelty versus the desire for home and intimacy and safety. Another card might say the image of floating through the sky like a phantom. What I'm doing when I'm writing these cards up is brainstorming, going through my notes in my head to think of everything I might want to use to write whatever it is I'm about to write. When I've written down everything I can think of, I take the cards and I spread them out on the floor or the dining room table, and I start looking for categories. I look for ways of grouping together the cards so that they're not just a random collection of concepts and images and dialogue, but rather conceptual clusters. The cards start to tell me a story about structure. I already know I have a story I want to tell, but by doing this exercise with the cards, I start to figure out how I want to tell the story, how I want to organize the material, what my big themes are going to be if I don't already know them. And even if I do, in that process, I'm figuring out what goes where. Once I know which scenes and images and statements and ideas go together, then I have to figure out the order in which I'm going to put them. And we'll talk about that in the next segment. You might want to give this card approach a try to see if it works for you. Contemplate the personal essay or memoir you're working on. Start jotting down all of the images and information and dialogue you have swirling in your head. When you've written up all your cards and put down everything that you've been holding in your mind on whatever this topic is, spread them out and see if there are any natural groupings, cards that just automatically belong together. I'm very visual and analog, so I like to do this like literally with physical note cards in physical space. But if your brain is different and you like to do everything on a computer, try it that way. Make a list of all the nuggets you have, concepts, images, scenes, and ideas, and then cut and paste them into whatever groupings make sense to you. Thematic groupings, chronological groupings, like childhood, adolescence, adulthood, or it could be before, during, and after the central event in your story. Whatever makes sense to you. Follow your instincts, but try to be flexible too. Sometimes my instinct leads me to just the right place, and sometimes they're just a start, and I have to rethink once I've carried out my instinct and realized it doesn't work the way I want it to on the page. Try to look at that process with curiosity rather than frustration. The goal isn't to write your book or essay as quickly as possible. The goal is to write it as well as possible. So one way to organize a story is obviously chronologically, and that can work beautifully. It's very often the way public figures, people who are very well accomplished or well known, organize their memoirs because everything about them will be of interest to the public. People already have all sorts of ideas about, say, Nelson Mandela, and they want to hear his whole story in his memoir because it's so historically significant. Katharine Graham, the legendary publisher of the Washington Post during Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, wrote a fabulous memoir entitled Personal History. And it's organized chronologically, at least in part because every period of her life was fascinating. She grew up at the peak of New York society on Fifth Avenue. Her parents were friends with Eleanor Roosevelt and Auguste Rodin and Albert Einstein and pretty much everyone else who was interesting and important and alive at that time. So all of that is interesting to a reader. Plus, Graham manages to initiate themes and to indicate mounting conflicts in that section that will play out throughout the book. Next, there's Graham's young adulthood, when she married the brilliant but manic-depressive editor, Phil Graham, who inherits her father's newspaper, the Washington Post, and then Graham cheats on her. And then he kills himself. And then she has to take over the Post. So it's the third section of the book in which she comes into her own at the newspaper and becomes a terrifically famous and accomplished publisher who is influential in world events and starts to really embrace her own power. A chronological approach in that memoir makes sense because, first of all, her whole life is inherently interesting. And as a newspaper woman, she knows that. She understands what constitutes a juicy story. But furthermore, she makes it all come together around this central conflict, which is that on the one hand, she's painfully shy and insecure and feels ugly and unworthy. And we see where that starts when she writes about her childhood. And on the other hand, she's dutiful and extremely smart, and history and circumstance kind of airdrop her into this incredibly powerful position. And her insecurity is then in conflict with her sense of duty. Ultimately, her sense of duty outweighs her self-doubt, and she excels. She picks up the pieces after she's been cheated on by this man that she's madly in love with, and she figures out a way to raise these kids of theirs as a single mother, and she pilots the Post through publishing the Pentagon Papers, and so on. But writing your story from birth to the present is not the only option. Bill Clegg wrote a memoir specifically about his addiction. He may dip into his childhood in order to give the reader an idea about the roots of his addiction, but it's still a memoir of addiction rather than an exhaustive autobiography. Joyce Carol Oates wrote a memoir called A Widow's Story, and while she touches on her childhood and her glittering career as an author in that book, it's really the story of losing her husband and how she copes with his death. If you are focusing on a particular aspect of your life rather than the whole darn thing, even within that approach, chronological organization of your material is only one option. I can also structure my work thematically. I can have a chapter about, say, adultery and talk about the ways it has affected my life and my relationships and the relationships of people I'm close to. And I don't have to start by talking about the first instance of adultery I encountered and end by talking about the last one. Maybe I'd start with the worst and most painful experience and then backtrack to a fairly unimportant incident for contrast. Or maybe I'd start with the unimportant incident as a way in and then descend into the more destructive example. The most important thing is that when you're contemplating how to order your scenes or chapters or ideas, you always want to keep in mind the central conflict in your story and structure your writing to emphasize it. So first, take a moment to think about what that central conflict is. And keep in mind, conflict doesn't have to be a fight, though of course it can be. A fight between warring ethnic groups, a struggle for dominance between two brothers, a custody battle between former spouses. But conflict can also be internal. Joan Didion's conflict in The Year of Magical Thinking is between her need to grieve her husband's death, on the one hand, and her inability to accept it as real and permanent on the other. She can't bring herself to get rid of his clothes because he will need them when he comes back. Most of her brain knows he isn't coming back, of course, but some part of her can't bear to fully admit this harsh fact. So there's a conflict, which is what creates the drama in that book. The drama isn't, will he die or won't he? He's dead. We know it from the outset of the story. The drama is, will she bring herself to accept this irrefutable fact? The story is how that happens. The year in which she slowly sorts through their life together, and all the reporting she's done over the years about people who've endured loss. Conflict is drama. And we always want some drama in a story, or it's not really a story. If Joan Didion just told us her husband was dead, and she was really sad about it, and here's the story of how they met and married, and then he died, that wouldn't be a fabulous book. It would be more like a journal. someone going over what had happened because she had the urge to write about it. Conflict is what takes a bunch of incidents and dramatizes them. It's what makes the reader keep reading because conflict is something that is active. Suspense is the state of anticipation for the resolution of a conflict or question, and that's what we want to create, albeit with some subtlety. One of my favorite personal essays is called Out of Ohio, and it's by Ian Fraser. The conflict in that piece is between his passionate, nostalgic love for his hometown, Hudson, Ohio, versus his desire to move on. And there's this very understated kind of suspense that sets in, because as Fraser describes this safe and wonderful place, we start to wonder what happened to it. He tells the reader early on, I'm quoting, "Most modern people don't belong any place as intimately as we belonged to Hudson." That sounds great. Why'd you stop belonging there? Once you've figured out what your conflict is, and there can certainly be more than one, you want to think about how to begin and end and structure your story to best dramatize that conflict. Hi again, and welcome to week 3. This week, we're going to talk about finding your voice, how to create the tone and style on the page that really feels right and true and authentically you. Now, to do this, you need to write a lot. There's no substitute for that. You just have to put in the time. Goethe said, "Whatever you think you can do or believe you can do, begin it." Action has magic, grace, and power in it. This is absolutely true of writing. The only way to get better, to get closer to your goal, is to start and then keep going. The more you write, the more you'll know about writing. Every sentence you write makes you incrementally better. You learn some tiny thing every time you craft a paragraph. People ask me sometimes what I do when I suffer from writer's block, and I always sort of laugh because writer's block isn't really an option for me. I have to finish my pieces or I won't get paid, and then I'll have a major problem. So even if I'm up till 4 a.m, the night before something's due, which has happened more recently than I'd like to admit, I still always get my writing done, if for no other reason than it's due. If writing is your job, you don't really have a choice. But if you're just starting out, chances are this isn't your job. And I think it's actually much harder to force yourself to write in that situation. I think it's a big advantage having to get stuff done. And that's why, if you're anything like me, it's a good idea to create a situation where you'll have some deliverables. Now, if you're a naturally disciplined person and you have no trouble making yourself sit down and work, and you do it every day, no matter what, that's great. I envy you. But if that's not the case, in addition to completing this class, I strongly recommend joining or forming a writing group with other people who you find interesting and who take their work seriously, so that you can share and critique each other's work, and most importantly, so you'll have deadlines to meet. If that feels overwhelming, try to find just one friend or colleague who is as serious about writing as you are, and come up with a schedule. Maybe you exchange work once a week, or every 2 weeks, or once a month, whatever feels right to you. And then give each other feedback, and I hope that person's feedback will be valuable in and of itself. But even if it's not, at least you're getting work done. At least you're forcing yourself to write, because you know you've got a deadline. You know someone is expecting you to hand something over. I have friends who have hired writing coaches for this reason, and if that's something that's comfortable and affordable to you, then that's great. But if it's not, think about finding a writing partner. Just someone who has the same goal as you do to write well. And then no money has to exchange hands. You're offering each other the same thing, which is feedback, but also just someone who expects to have writing handed over to him. My writing partner is my editor at The New Yorker, who's a guy named Nick Troutwine, who I love a lot. And sometimes the only reason I finish something, and I'm serious, the only way I'm able to force myself to write that last 1,000 words or even that last paragraph is that I know Nick is waiting for my piece. And I don't want to disappoint him. Now, I realize I'm not making this sound very pleasant when I say things like I force myself to write, but it is work. To be good at anything, you can't just dabble. You have to really commit yourself and put the time in to become skilled. And there's a payoff. When I hit a groove and somehow the language is coming to me without a lot of struggle, and a paragraph or a page, or once in a blue moon, a whole piece feels like it's writing itself, that's euphoria. That's the best. That feeling is so good and so pleasurable, I keep going. Month after month, year after year, gutting it out when it's not pleasant and it is hard, because I want the next hit of that feeling, that great feeling when it just flows. And I'm totally absorbed in what I'm writing. And I don't even want to stop to eat, which is really saying something because I really like to eat. Okay, we talked about the hard part, the discipline. Let's talk about the wonderful part now, the pleasurable part. When we describe a setting or person in words, the language we select brings with it associations, connotations, and the resonance of sound itself. Today, we'll consider the way the tone of your writing shapes the reader's experience of your story. One character engaging in one activity can be made to mean lots of different things depending on the way a writer decides to sound and the emotional impact of the language he or she employs. The language we use to tell our stories is, of course, every bit as crucial as the stories themselves. What I love about words as building blocks for communication and storytelling is the way each one is packed with associations. If I'm describing the night sky, I could call it sparkling, which brings associations of excitement and festivity. I could describe it conversely as starless and bleak. I could talk about the endless night to describe a situation where I was suffering through insomnia or grief. Or I could write about the limitless night if I was, let's say, telling a story about being out in a big city until dawn, meeting all sorts of interesting people in varied circumstances. The way words are packed with meaning, not just the literal meaning of sparkling or starless or endless or limitless, but the connotations, the emotional freight those words carry. The way sparkling has associations with champagne and glitter and stars, and endless has this slightly ominous, overwhelming quality, while limitless sounds full of possibility. That is where the magic is for me. That's probably my favorite part of writing, when a word comes to you and it just feels perfect for what you're trying to say. That's a great feeling. It never gets old. So let's look at this in action. Zadie Smith wrote a personal essay I really love about her father and her family's sense of humor called Dead Man Laughing, in which she writes about trying to convince her friends of how funny her father's old comedy records were. She writes, "I demanded complete silence, was in the habit of lifting the stylus and replaying a section if any incidental noise should muffle a line, and generally leached all potential pleasure from the exercise with laborious explanations of the humor, and said humor's possible obfuscation by period details, ration books, shillings and farthings, coins for the meter, and so on." The words she chooses are doing so much in that sentence to enrich its meaning. She says, leached all potential pleasure from the exercise, for instance. And so somewhere in our heads, whether we realize it or not, We have the repellent image of a slimy leech sucking the life out of something. She also sets up the sentence in this very arch way that mirrors what she's telling us she was like as a nerdy comedy know-it-all. She says it leached all of the potential pleasure out of the exercise rather than it leached all of the fun or all of the joy or any other monosyllabic expression out of the exercise. She calls playing a comedy record for another kid an exercise, which has connotations of school and gym class. And she says laborious explanations, which again is in this professorial register. Even her turn of phrase, said humor, works to give us an image of her as a relentless smarty pants. Obviously, what she's doing is making fun of herself, which is pretty on point in an essay about humor. Now, in a totally different vein, listen to how Alexandra Fuller uses words and their connotations to build a sense of threat in her memoir, Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. She's describing an illness she had as a child when she first moved to Southern Africa. She writes, "No one could say what was wrong with me. They took my temperature and fed me aspirin, which I puked up in bitter streams through my nose. They bathed my arms and legs with a damp washcloth until I sat up and demanded food. Say please, said Mum. Although I had been conceived in Africa, I had been started in urban England, like a delicate vegetable started indoors where it is safe at a vulnerable age from pests and too much sun. I had the constitution of a missionary. Within a day, I was well enough to continue the journey to Rhodesia. Up through South Africa, the train labored in the heat, pulling herself up hills, chaka-chaka, an Ndebele war sound, through burning flat savanna that looked as though it might ignite at the sight of our metallic speed, slicing on hot wheels ever north. This was where Cecil John Rhodes had intended for we British to go. From Cape to Cairo had been his dream. One long stain of British territory up the spine of Africa. So there's this perfect image she gives us of a delicate baby vegetable coddled in the safety of the hothouse that is England. And obviously, when this little turnip gets to Africa, the pests and the sun prey on her vulnerability and afflict her with this mysterious illness. But then the threat continues throughout the passage I just read in her subsequent word choices, which all summon danger and violence. The very sound the train makes is a war cry, chaka chaka. The savannah is burning. They are slicing on hot wheels. And then the strongest word choice of all is the dream that the British will create a stain up the spine of Africa. When I think of a stain on a spine, I picture an X-ray in which you can see cancerous cells dyed with radioactive ink. That may not be the precise image that comes to your mind, but a stain is never good. A stain is always a kind of indelible ruining of what was once pristine. So there is the information conveyed by what Fuller says. She was sick, she's from England, she's a kid, she gets on the train and heads north through Africa once she's better. And then there's this other kind of tonal information that conveys danger and violence and struggle embedded in the words themselves. Be aware when you're writing in the first person or writing anything at all that you have an opportunity to communicate to the reader on multiple fronts in any given sentence. You get to say what you mean, but you also get to convey what you feel and what you want your reader to feel through your word choices. I think of it like planting a hedge in front of my house. I get these beautiful plants to look at, but I also get a shield from the sound of the cars going by. And I get this kind of structural definition of my yard and my garden. The hedge does all this work at once, and all of those jobs are separate. And it works best if I contemplate all those functions before I plant. So when I'm writing, I try to think similarly of the basic information I want to communicate and the tonal resonance I want to achieve through the sound and connotation of my word choices, and the way a sentence or paragraph or section fits within the whole of whatever it is I'm writing. Now we're going to talk a little about using humor and self-effacement in first-person writing. Acknowledging your own peccadillos and failings is always worth doing, even if the sins are small and the treatment is funny rather than penitent. First of all, because as we discussed earlier, it makes you a more trustworthy narrator and increases your intimacy with your reader if you are able to articulate something that the reader is probably going to notice anyway. If you do it well, it's a way of winning the reader over. Here's David Sedaris doing this in a recent piece for The New Yorker called Active Shooter, about his experience at a firing range. "Lisa, you're a natural," Lonnie said. "Okay, Mike, now you give it a try." I looked around, confused. "Excuse me?" He handed me the .38. "You came here to shoot, didn't you?" I accepted the gun, and from then until the time we left, my name was Mike, which was more than a little demoralizing. Not getting the, "Wait a minute, the David Sedaris?" I have come to expect when meeting someone was bad enough. But being turned into a Mike, of all things? I thought of the time a woman approached me in a hotel lobby. "Excuse me," she said, "but are you here for the Lions Club meeting?" That's the Mike of organizations. Now, obviously, David Sedaris is consistently hilarious, and most of us are never going to achieve anything near his level of funny. But we can take a lesson from him here by admitting that he has come to expect, wait a minute, the David Sedaris when he meets someone. He's bringing us into his head. He's including us in a way that makes us feel connected to him. And it's always funny to acknowledge your own vanities. Always. Because we all have them, and it's just a hilarious thing. We are, all of us human beings, so invested in maintaining certain ideas about ourselves. And the lengths we'll go to uphold these myths is just funny. My friend Matt has invented this imaginary game show, and it will always remain imaginary because the only way to play is if God is the host. So anyway, the show is called Accept or Deny, and you go on, and God starts making statements about you. And it starts with things that are easy to accept. Like God will say, "Miss Levy, you are frighteningly obsessed with your garden." Okay, I accept. And I press the accept buzzer. And the things get harder and harder to accept. "You're rude to your mother sometimes." Uh-oh, I don't want to admit that, but okay, I guess I'll accept. It is God telling me this. But eventually, for pretty much every person alive, there comes something where we just can't resist denying, even if an omnipotent creator told us it was absolutely true. "Miss Levy, you're weird about money." It's too much. I'd have to hit deny. Matt's joke is that whatever that thing is, eventually God will say it, and he'll see you going for the deny buzzer, and he'll remind you, "Miss Levy, I am in fact God. The statements I make are absolutely, undeniably fact. But there's some quality that each of us has that is so shameful to us, we just have to deny it. We just can't admit whatever it is." If you can figure out the things that are hardest to admit about yourself, and then acknowledge and make fun of those qualities, it's funny, it's interesting, and you might actually learn something about yourself that's useful. Let's look again at Ian Fraser's personal essay, Out of Ohio. Now, in and of itself, the idea seems mundane. A guy is nostalgic about his hometown, which he loved, but he wanted to become a writer, so like many writers before him, he moved to New York City. And in fact, that essay, Out of Ohio, is included in a collection of Fraser's pieces called Gone to New York. What makes the essay fabulous is the richness of the language he uses to tell the story, the internal conflict he brings out to dramatize the story, and the humor with which he tells it, particularly the humor he uses about himself. He writes, Sometimes I try, usually without success, to describe how sweet it was to grow up in a small Ohio town 40 years ago. As I get into the details, corniness tinges my voice and a proprietary sentimentality that puts people off. I love that. Corniness tinges my voice. It's such a unique way to put it and so completely vivid and clear. Then later, he's talking about right after he graduated from college, after he'd left Ohio for the first time to go to Harvard, and he writes, I graduated with a degree in general studies and no clear plans. Mostly, I wanted to go back home. I had had enough of the East, a place I was unable to make much sense of. My girlfriend at college, Sarah, whom I was too self-absorbed to appreciate, became fed up with my increasingly wistful hometown reminiscences as graduation day approached. Don't invite me to your Ohio wedding, was one of her last remarks to me. His self-effacement in this piece is essential, not just because it's fun, which it certainly is, but because it mirrors a theme he's writing about, which is the lure of nostalgia. So he's making fun of himself and giving other characters in the piece the opportunity to make fun of him too. And it's amusing, and it builds trust with the reader, and maybe most importantly, it underscores the very conflict he's writing about and gets us towards his point, which is that you can never go home again to the home in your mind, because as you age, you change. Your mind changes. And the home you are recalling is partly the creation of a mind you used to have but don't anymore. So let's practice this with an exercise. Think of an embarrassing incident. Be as objective as possible when you write about it. Try to use the third-person perspective, even though you're writing in the first person. Remember the exercise we did earlier on in this course. You're trying to use a God's eye perspective, even though you're describing things using the first person. The way Ian Fraser is using I, but also describing what he thinks other people's experiences are. He says his sentimentality puts people off, right? So he's entering other people's experiences, even though he's in the first person. He's using empathy. Use as many concrete details as you can to describe the situation, and take about 5 or even 10 minutes to do this if you need to. The video will stop and you can hit continue whenever you're ready. Hi again. Okay, so ask yourself why this was so mortifying. Why do you remember it? What sensitivity of yours does it strum? What thing about you that makes you want to hit the deny button does this tap into? Look at what you wrote and see if you can find connections to other forces that were at play in your life at the time, or are still in play in your life now. Think about whether you can use what you learned from this to inform whatever you're working on now. Finding your voice in the first person requires not just crafting the voice of your narrator, but crafting dialogue, interactions. And we're lucky to have with us today a master of dialogue, the novelist Amy Bloom. Thank you so much for being with us, Amy.
I'm happy to be here.
I remember you telling me 20 years ago that I should always remember that dialogue is conversation's greatest hits.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means?
I could. I haven't changed my mind about that.
Good.
And I'm not sure I've really expanded on it either.
Perfect.
But I remember sitting in a bar, actually, in Colorado, and a writer saying to me, my students think that dialogue is conversation. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to get them to understand it is conversation's greatest hits. What you never want is the opening of the scene in which it says, I walked into the cafe. I said, I'll have a double latte with sugar, please. The woman behind the counter said, the sugar's over there. Okay, I said. After a couple of minutes, they called my name. I went and got my coffee. Thank you, I said again. You're welcome, she said. See you next time. There is no reason to write that kind of scene ever, ever, ever,
Right.
unless the next moment is an explosion.
Is then he shot me.
Then he shot me. Then she
Yeah.
shot me.
Yeah.
Then she knocked the cup out of my hand and knocked me to the ground. But unless that's happening and the dialogue, which is dull and flat, is a setup,
Yeah.
there's no reason for it. And part of it is that it's hard for us sometimes to tell the difference between dialogue that is leading and dialogue that just leaves us cold.
That just takes up time and space. Yeah.
That's right. And part of it is I think we tend to transcribe conversations because they are authentic. But the fact is that most conversation is authentically dull.
Right.
It's not that interesting. If you and I are talking about how we got here, what route we took, did you get gas, did you pick up some coffee?
Right.
That's not interesting. You have to think about who is speaking. And one of my favorite things that I often think about, which I learned not from a writer, but from an elderly psychoanalyst, is always the question in dialogue is, why this? Why now? What is the moment that I wish to convey right now in this conversation? Who is saying it? How am I going to learn more about the speaker from what they say?
And how they say it,
And
right?
how they say it. It is the how and the why is pretty much all you have with language.
So in addition to thinking about what's interesting, what's sparkling, what's not just, random back and forth of information, but actually interesting, what should we be trying to accomplish when we write dialogue? What do we want to know about the people speaking through what they say, besides the actual information those words convey?
Right, and the actual information is almost always the least of it, unless you are writing a thriller and it's get to the mouth of the cave, don't forget your explosives or your flags or the train. But most of the time, that's not what we're writing about. Most of the time, dialogue takes the place of exposition. There's a wonderful phrase that Ursula Le Guin uses in her nice little book, Steering the Craft, in which she says, part of our goal is to avoid the expository lump, the chunk of information that just sits there on the page. And part of what you can do in dialogue is fold in the information. Maybe you don't have to say that somebody is 5 years old, or that they're this tall, or that they're this beautiful. Maybe part of the way we understand their appearance is through the way somebody else is speaking to them. Or maybe we begin to understand the relationship better. There is all the difference in the world between, are you wearing that? And I love what you're wearing. Or who picked that out? They're all different things, and they all convey different things, both about the person who's being spoken to and the speaker. So you always have to have, in some sense, both your inner ear working so you can hear the people who are speaking, but also your own sense, sort of cinematically, of how is this unfolding? Where is this leading? As you and I have talked about other things, you want the scene to answer a question. Who are these people? And why do I care?
And the way they speak. I mean, it all starts with listening, doesn't it? That's what I thought of when you
Yes.
mentioned a shrink before, which is, of course, Amy was a psychologist?
Yeah.
First, or simultaneously with being a writer. And it makes sense because that's about listening. And when we're listening with an ear towards writing dialogue, we want to be hearing what syntax says about someone's geographical, socioeconomic history, right? I mean, what all should we be listening for?
I think you are listening first for rhythm and inflection, and also trying not to fool yourself that you know things you don't know. If you're not from Alabama in the United States, and you really haven't heard a lot of people from Alabama talk, writing your version of an Alabama accent is not likely to be a pretty sight. It's not likely to be persuasive, it's not likely to fool people from Alabama, and it's not likely to even impress people who aren't from Alabama.
Because it won't ring true.
It won't have that rhythm. It won't have that inflection. So you always want to have a really good understanding of just the poetry of the speech. You think of that as one of the ways of understanding how people reveal who they are. So I always say do a lot of eavesdropping. And if you are writing from somebody, about somebody from a culture other than your own, not only go to the movies and watch television shows from that part of the country or from that time period, but also any kinds of recordings of regular everyday speech that you can get, because it's very helpful. But even when we are writing about our own culture, you have to listen. Because even if we are all born in the same state and in the same country, we do not all sound alike. You and I have lots of things in common in our
the way
backgrounds.
we sound. Yeah.
Yes, but we don't sound identical.
Right.
And so how do we write a dialogue in which you emerge as your own unique character, and I do too, that there's no blurring.
Yeah.
And that's one of the real goals in dialogue. You should be able to tell who is who without any dialogue tags. He said, Ariel said, Amy said. I should be able, in reading that dialogue, to know who is who without any identifiers.
That's such a good thing for us to look for when we're writing dialogue. If you took away those attributions, would you have a sense, just from the way the voice sounds, of who is saying what? Which brings us to another question. Since in this class, we're writing nonfiction, we're writing in the first person, we're not making anything up, do you have any advice for our writers about when it makes sense for the essayist or the memoirist to write in her own voice versus putting something in the mouths of others? So when does it make sense to say, my mother told me she loved me, versus, I love you, my mother said? How do we know when to move from our own voice into the dialogue, into the voices of others? Is there any kind of...
I think that's a great question. And I think one of the things that it brings us to, again, is the rhythm of the writing. If you have had 2 nonstop pages of, I said, oh, also I thought, and don't forget I remembered, and then I said, it would be a nice time to bring in another speaker, because enough of you already.
Right.
Also, I love you, my mother said, gives you the opportunity to get a little closer to the mother.
Right.
Maybe not only just what she was wearing, but she was wearing her favorite sweater, the one that she kept her cigarettes in the cardigan pocket.
Right.
I only ever saw her smoking in the backyard, in the garden, by herself. And now we've taken a little tiny exit from the scene into a little something of the mother, and then you can bring us back to your point of view, and then you can bring us back to what the mother said. But I think dialogue often offers us an opportunity to see in a slightly different light and to hear in a different voice, which I think is crucial.
And I think that for nonfiction writers, it's a unique opportunity, because I think one of the fears that nonfiction writers have, we're not used to having the nerve to occupy someone else's brain and mouth. And dialogue is a place where we can do that.
Absolutely. So maybe it's not only just that your mother said, I love you, but you also get to write about how she said it. What was she doing before she said it? What was she doing after she said it? It's true that one is not necessarily using a lot of imagination in constructing the storyline of a memoir, but it still requires empathy.
Absolutely.
And that still requires imagination.
Absolutely.
What might that have been like for her in that moment as she's talking to you? What else was happening in her life? How do you want to turn the light on that a little bit? And dialogue is one of those opportunities. Dialogue, and then in some sense what I think of as behind the scenes writing. This is what she said. This is what had happened before. This is what happened at the end of this scene. You know, so that we are moving not only from your voice to another character's voice, but also in some sense from, you know, up on the stage to behind the stage.
Absolutely. That's great. All right. Thank you so much, Amy. That was really helpful.
Thank you.
Welcome back. A good memoir doesn't just tell a tale, it grapples with philosophical problems. So, how does a writer introduce her pet concepts or questions into her story? What is the reciprocal relationship between intellectual or moral questions and plot? This week, we will look at the way a writer's point is not simply the conclusion of a story, it is the story's spine. Knowing your point or points and weaving them throughout your story is a way to keep the fabric of the whole thing strong and unified. When I wrote my memoir, the thing that told me this can be done, I have a book here, is not that a lot of bad things happened to me all at once in a fairly dramatic fashion. That's a story, but it's not a point. I couldn't have written my story if I didn't have an idea, a point that drew everything together. The point in my case was that we live in a world where we have control of so much. We can take pictures without any film on these handheld computers that tell us how to get where we're going and who Franz Ferdinand was and the dates of World War II and the right way to get out a chocolate stain, and allow us to communicate with our friends and family on the other side of the world with the push of a button, as if they were in the next room. All of that was impossible and non-existent in the world I was born into. And so much else besides technology has changed so quickly. In my lifetime here in the United States, we've had the women's movement and the first Black president and the advent of gay marriage and all of this progressive change that seemed impossible before it happened. So the idea of my book was that all of that change suggests that the rules do not apply, which was the title of my memoir. That anything can be overturned or controlled if you try hard enough, but the human body doesn't play by those rules. Mother Nature always has the last word. And so my story of loss is also the story of how I became aware of what I just told you, how I was liberated from my illusion of control to some extent. If I just had the story of losing my son and my spouse and my house, it wouldn't have worked for me as a book because that's just a tale of woe. That's just, I'm really sad because I lost all this. I needed it to mean something. So that the idea, the meaning, was the spine of my story. The meaning held it together and made it about something bigger than just me. Whatever I was writing about, whether it was a scene from my childhood, or the first day of my job, or the really bad stuff, all the loss I just mentioned, whatever I was writing, it had to have some strong connection to that spine of meaning in order to be one coherent entity, one book. Now, in a personal essay, knowing your point is of course essential because the thing that makes an essay is that it makes a statement or poses a question. In Roger Angel's beautiful first-person piece, This Old Man, we learn many things. The details of his aches and pains, the deep sorrow of losing his wife and the way he still hears her voice and feels her presence throughout his day, what he calls the oceanic force and mystery of losing his daughter to suicide. All of these things come together to make the point of the piece, which I think he articulates very clearly in this passage I'm going to read to you. He writes, "We geezers carry about a bulging directory of dead husbands or wives, children, parents, lovers, brothers and sisters, dentists and shrinks, office sidekicks, summer neighbors, classmates and bosses, all once entirely familiar to us and seen as part of the safe landscape of the day. It's no wonder we're a bit bent. The surprise for me is that the accruing weight of these departures doesn't bury us, and that even the pain of an almost unbearable loss gives way quite quickly to something more distant, but still stubbornly gleaming. Isn't that beautiful? And it really is his point. He is surprised to find that the accruing weight of these departures doesn't bury us, and that even the pain of an almost unbearable loss gives way quite quickly to something more distant, but still stubbornly gleaming. And notice that he uses the word gleaming. The connotations of that word, gleaming, are like waves gleaming in the sun, or diamonds gleaming on the queen's jewelry. Beautiful things. The pain of loss, he suggests with that word choice, is not only agonizing and nearly unbearable, it is also in its own way radiant, because it gives us our humanity. Life would not be as precious as it is if it were not tenuous. It doesn't feel good when the distant pain of loss gleams stubbornly on your emotional horizon. Anyone who has ever lost someone she loves knows that pain is stubborn and never really goes away, and it feels absolutely awful, but it gleams. In its way, it's beautiful, because in order to really grieve someone's departure, you must have loved him. Grief is predicated on love, and love gleams. Roger Angell says all of that without saying it, just through his word choice. And that's the work of a master. He's also a master of balancing the profound with the humorous, the dark with the light. He starts that paragraph about grief with the sentence, "We geezers carry around a bulging directory of dead people." We geezers. I mean, it's such a charming way to start a paragraph that ends with this incredibly painful truth about being a human and suffering the death of loved ones. And none of these insights, jokes, or beautiful images are in the piece just for fun or just to show off. They all contribute to his point. All of his techniques in that piece add up to a unified whole, and that's what you want. One of the things that's difficult about writing in the first person is that most of us want to avoid sounding self-congratulatory on the one hand, or self-pitying on the other. And those are very important things if we want to avoid alienating our readers. One way to deal with this is through understatement, which can be an incredibly powerful tool for conveying pain. I often find when I'm writing or reading that the most emotionally effective way to communicate or learn of something terrible is sort of sideways. There's something about sliding into a terrible, heartbreaking detail that's just extremely poignant. Listen to Roger Angell for a moment. He starts out talking about the death of his dog, a terrier called Harry, and listen to where he goes with it. Alone in our 5th floor apartment, as was usual during working hours, he became unhinged by a noisy thunderstorm and went out a front window left a quarter open on a muggy day. I knew him well and could summon up his feelings during the brief moments of that leap. The welcome coolness of the rain on his muzzle and shoulders, the excitement of air and space around his outstretched body. Here in my 10th decade, I can testify that the downside of great age is the room it provides for rotten news. Living long means enough already. When Harry died, Carol and I couldn't stop weeping. We sat in the bathroom with his retrieved body on a mat between us, the light brown patches on his back and the near black of his ears still darkened by the rain, and passed a Kleenex box back and forth between us. Not all the tears were for him. 2 months earlier, a beautiful daughter of mine, my oldest child, had ended her life. And the oceanic force and mystery of that event had not left full space for tears. I suspect there's something even more devastating about learning of this oceanic loss this way, than if he started the piece by saying, "When I was 80-something years old, my daughter killed herself." It's like how watching someone try not to cry is almost sadder than watching someone sob. I'm not a fan of repression in life, but on the page, I think the controlled expression of sorrow is so potent. It's counterintuitive, but I think the quieter your expression of suffering, the more intense the reader often feels it. It's one of the ironies of writing in the first person, just as, weirdly enough, the more readily and heartily you admit your flaws, the better you look to the reader, as long as you find a way to do it that's really genuine and heartfelt, because inauthenticity is as unattractive on the page as it is in person and as glaring. Ian Fraser does a similar thing in his essay Out of Ohio. He's contemplating why life was so sweet for him. And he starts out by looking at the historical factors. He writes, fathers and a few mothers had steady jobs, pensions, health insurance. The economic difficulties that would later take a lot of those away, and that I still don't understand, had not yet visibly begun. Vietnam was winding down. The draft had just ended, removing a load from all our minds, etc. In my case, life was good by comparison because it had recently been so bad. The previous December, my 15-year-old brother, Fritz, had died of leukemia. After that, the last thing my parents wanted to do was to keep my other siblings and me from having any fun we could have. It's extremely understated, right? And from there, he just keeps on rolling. He doesn't dwell on this extremely painful, transformative detail because it's actually not the point. The point of Out of Ohio is really that he can never go home again. That the yearning he feels for that safe, halcyon time and place also has to do with yearning for who he was then, how hopeful and innocent and unconfused about his place in the world he was. So his brother's death and his feelings about it aren't the point, but they do color his experience and our experience reading the essay. I think these kinds of powerful, understated revelations are sort of like seasoning. You put a little salt in a chocolate chip cookie, not to undermine the sweetness, but to offset it, to highlight it with a little contrast, a little taste of something else. And in an essay like Out of Ohio that's very sweet, it's so powerful to have the seasoning of suffering. Once we hear about the death of Fraser's 15-year-old brother, we know it wasn't all just ice cream and Peter, Paul, and Mary on the record player and wiffle ball at sunset for him and his family back in Ohio. Fraser suffered deeply, as we all do, and it makes the essay so much richer that he acknowledges this. There's one other reason to engage in understatement. When I was writing about losing a baby in an essay called Thanksgiving in Mongolia, and we'll give you the link, to express my sorrow about it, I said that I couldn't stop looking at a picture I'd taken of the baby. I didn't say to the reader, I cried. I didn't say to the reader, I was in agony. You can figure all that out. If a woman who's lost a baby can't stop staring at a picture of it, guess what? She's in a lot of pain. The reason not to state all that out is it allows the reader to have an active role in interpretation. You give the reader enough information to join you in experience, but then you allow the reader to have his or her own experience of going all the way there based on the information you've given him. So what if you don't know what your point is? The last thing we want to do in this course is discourage you from writing. And indeed, if you know the story that you want to tell, but you don't know what it means, you may need to find the meaning through writing. So just start wherever you can, wherever you feel inspired to. If you know you want to tell the story of your first love, but you don't know why, maybe when you're writing it, you'll be struck by the way the sentences you're writing about this person you used to love remind you of what you feel about your current partner, or your dad, Or maybe the sentences remind you of what it was like to be young and passionate, and you're feeling a longing for that kind of vividness. Who knows? I'm not interested personally in writing as a kind of therapy. I'm interested in writing that strives towards art. But the fact is that as you strive to make art, you can accidentally find catharsis and meaning and make connections you weren't expecting to along the way throughout the process, if you let yourself really get absorbed in writing. That's great. It doesn't mean you're finished, however. If you get to an insight through your writing, you then have to open your mind to the possibility that that insight is in fact the point, is the thing you want this piece of writing to mean. And you have to be open to the possibility that it isn't. You may have to go through and look at all the questions and insights in your first draft and decide which is the most interesting and powerful. And then go back and thread that idea through in other places, because chances are, if it's so interesting and it's in your head, it's already on the page in some kind of quiet, nascent form, waiting for you to go back over it with the equivalent of a highlighter pen. What I mean by that is that if you realize that your story means something, go back through the piece and look for places where you've flicked at the idea, where you've suggested it. And then in those places, expand if you can, go deeper, refine it. Bring it out in all the ways we've talked about. If you realize you mean to say something about, for instance, the nature of competition between you and your best friend, go back through and see where you can use words that carry that connotation, that are naturally impregnated with associations of races. Look for places where you can be funny or authentically self-effacing about your own ruthlessness to win. If there's an example or scene that can be made into the epitome of this competition, enhance that scene. Make it as strong as possible because you've realized that's your central conflict. And somewhere in the piece, you probably want to articulate what it is you're getting at. The way Roger Angell told us, the surprise for me is that the accruing weight of these departures doesn't bury us, and that even the pain of an almost unbearable loss gives way quite quickly to something more distant but still stubbornly gleaming. You don't have to articulate your point or your insight or the question you're posing in the piece or the memoir, but experiment with that. It's amazingly productive to try to put your point into words. It helps you refine your mission. Just as an experiment, try and think of the thesis statement of what you are writing, or the question you are asking in your memoir or essay. What is it this piece wants to know or assert? What are you telling us? What is it that makes you want to write this story? If you look at your urge to write this particular piece, what is behind that? What drives it? If the drive is simply that it's a good story, then why? What makes it good? Is the conflict really intense? Is it that you feel like you're still there in some way and you want to bring the reader into that visceral experience with you? Like I said, if you don't know, start writing and maybe you'll find out. Good luck and keep writing. Remember, you'll never finish your book or your essay if you don't sit down and start.